Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin into the video. We're going to be talking about the Xbox One S again, because despite the fact that early reports had told us that the Xbox One S and the Xbox One, the original system, had exactly the same hardware in terms of raw performance, this appears to not be the case. Rod Fergusson, who is the Coalition Studios head, they are of course folks responsible for Gears of War 4, has told Polygon in an interview that the system does actually have a faster CPU and GPU compared to the original Xbox, but did not mention what the performance bump actually is. So, how he worded it is that Gears of War 4 employs a dynamic resolution system. This basically tweaks the game's rendering resolution depending on the workload so that the game maintains a stable frame rate. So, that would be 30 FPS for a single player game, 60 FPS for a multiplayer game. So how this works is if the GPU realizes, oh shit, it's going to take me a long time to process this, or rather the entire system thinks it's going to take me a long time to process this frame because let's say there's a lot of stuff on screen, it will drop down the native resolution of that frame. So for example, frame A could be 900p, frame B could be 792p, depending once again on the system's workload. But thanks to the more powerful Xbox One S, the Coalition engineers have been able to reduce the frequency of either frame rate or resolution dips, and therefore the game should theoretically perform better on the Xbox One S. Now, I will get into the high dynamic range stuff in just a moment, but I do want to talk about the performance. Now, this is based upon my assumption because we do not have performance numbers. So, for example, there are no key figures which says that the CPU is running at 1.85 gigahertz or that the GPU is running at 925 megahertz. There, I'm simply pulling figures out of my butt here. However, we can make a couple of assumptions. I think that the performance jump would be fairly, I wouldn't say small, but I wouldn't say it would be huge either. I would say that most likely 1.4, 1.5 teraflops at most. The reason is because much more than that, and you're starting to get into the territory of the PS4, and I imagine that Microsoft would have made a bigger deal of it. So in terms of the CPU, we could certainly see a minor CPU upclock, for example, running at 1.8 gigahertz. For the GPU, there's a couple of options. One is that we see an increase in the number of shaders available, 768 in the original model, so we could, for example, see a couple of extra compute units. Or the GPU could simply be running at a higher clock speed, which, if the whole thing is being made on 14nm, that's definitely a possibility. Or simply we're just getting better yields now, so Microsoft are better able to run the thing at higher clock speeds anyway. So for example, if they were to run the GPU at around the 920 megahertz, you get about 1.4, 1.42 teraflops of performance, which isn't exactly massive, but you could easily put in, let's say, around 10% increased GPU performance without too much difficulty, I imagine. I imagine more information, however, will emerge as the Xbox One gets closer to debuting in August, and then of course Gears of War 4 will launch on the Xbox One in October 11, 2016. One last thing I do want to touch on regarding Gears of War 4 before we move to the high dynamic range stuff is that they said that the Gears of War engine doesn't necessarily automatically ensure a native 4K version will be available for Project Scorpio. So, this is a direct quote, we have to look what the engine can do with the power that Scorpio has, because we're mastering at 4K, it's not about assets or art, it's about getting the milliseconds down in terms of getting the game at 4K at 60 or 30 FPS depending on single or multiplayer. What that basically means, if you want to cut through the gumph, is does the system still have enough performance to run at 4K with better artwork and better everything else, and be able to do it at a decent frame rate? Because remember, essentially milliseconds of what you have to render a frame of animation. For example, 16.6 if you're targeting 60, or 33.3 if you're targeting 30 FPS. When you start jumping up from, let's say, 1080p to 4K, you're asking a massive increase in performance extra from the GPU, about 4 times. It's 4 times the number of pixels, so you can quickly start swallowing up the extra performance of the Scorpio without too much of a problem. So what about high dynamic range? Because I actually got a couple of people asking me about that, because once again Microsoft did announce support for HDR on the console. So there's a couple of things. Firstly, what is high dynamic range? And secondly, what does it mean in terms of graphical fidelity? Oh, and of course, performance. The best way to describe this, the elevator pitch, is that you get a richer gamut of colours. That means you get, for example, whiter whites, deeper, darker blacks, and more subtle shades of grey in between. This essentially means that an image, let's say for the sake of argument you're rendering a field at night with fireworks going off, it means that you're going to get the more consistent look across multiple television sets, and more accurately, to describe this, you've also got a wider gamut of colours and better visual detail that you will be able to display. A very poor example, if you've ever tried to take a photo at night of stars or a moon or something like that, and then you think, well, that looks like shit, it doesn't look at all what it does to my eyes. You can think of very much the same thing. The camera simply could not capture the details which you can see natively with your eye unless you've got a really good camera. And it's very much the same here with televisions. So for example, if you're in a space battle and you've got the blackness of space, but you've also got loads of, say, explosions with various lasers going off at different colours and all of that stuff, you can start quickly, essentially, running into colours. And you want to preserve as many details as possible. For example, let's say you've got a very dark shade of grey. On a lot of televisions, it can almost become black. So the subtle nuances of colour can just simply disappear. So with high dynamic range, you are able to actually display those colours in a very vivid way. And AMD, by the way, were very vocal about HDR. In fact, I had an interview with AMD's Robert Hallock, and he discussed exactly this point. It's a fairly lengthy quote, but I'll read it out to you anyway. And this, by the way, was a question prompted because of the GDC conference presentation from Microsoft DirectX 12 advancements. They basically said that they really wanted to get HDR support and claimed that HDR adoption rates for displays, particularly going into 2017, would likely be much faster than 4K. So Robert Hallock said, I was about to say Richard Hallock, Robert Hallock said, "I'm a display snob, so HDR is one of those technologies I can't get enough of. Better contrast, blacker blacks, whiter whites, sharper picture, more nuance, more colours, more vivid colours, more accurate colours. HDR is a huge and obvious improvement in every conceivable way to measure the performance of a display. It's a technology that makes you say whoa when you see it for the first time, and it's really hard to step back to a SDR, a standard dynamic range television, you have at home. If you ever participated in the TN versus IPS debate, yeah, you can remember those times back in the days. Anyway, HDR is right up your alley. Those picture benefits extend to all sorts of content that is HDR aware, which can include movies, photos, and games. Just imagine a nighttime scene were as detailed and nuanced as daytime scenes. Imagine using shades of red, gold, and cyan you've never been able to see before. Imagine moonlight and starlight that's crisp and pure, that doesn't turn dark night into weird shades of grey. It's all possible with the HDR. GPUs based on Polaris architecture will support it, and we also plan to support the HDR on Fury, Nano, and R9 300 series too. HDR has little to no impact in overall performance of games, because games already render in HDR color spaces inside the game. A process called tone mapping then compresses and remaps the colors to finished frames that can be shown working on SDR or TV without appearing perceptually inaccurate. We're working with games developers to establish more intelligent tone mappers that can identify the capabilities of a HDR display and tone map that content to a HDR profile that perfectly matches what a display can do. As with any other monitor, the better the display is, the better the process will look. But in my opinion, any display looks much better than even the best SDR display." End quote. By the way, if you're not familiar with what tone mappers are, and this is a very layman's terms, if you want to Google this, feel free, but I don't want to eat up a lot of video discussing this. Think of a tone map as basically this shade of green that I'm rendering in game. Let's say pure green. So pure green, 255 green, 0 red, 0 blue in the RGB color space. That shade of green is this on the display, so that display knows exactly what you're talking about and the game knows what they're talking about. So for the sake of argument, you won't get weird things, and this is a ridiculously silly example, but you won't be showing a shade of blue, but in reality it's a shade of red on screen. Basically, it's show that you have accurate color spaces. Now, before I close off, there is a whole bunch of stuff that I need to be covering over the next couple of days. AIM is flat out busy covering E3. I'm busy with my own stuff. Obviously, the Xbox has kind of dropped a bombshell, so I need to do a full analysis of the Scorpio system and give some thoughts and opinions on that. I'm probably going to have to make that slip to the next couple of days. I'm currently handling a CPU review as well, which is taking up a lot of time because of E3. I'm doing a interview with the folks over at Vulcan, plus some other projects in the background. We've been doing some filming for some other stuff. It's absolutely crazy here. And I've been working very long days over the last week. So if production schedules slip a couple of days here or there, I can only apologise. It's just absolutely bonkers. But thanks for everyone who's recently subscribed. It means an awful lot to us, and it's certainly damn good motivation. But, oh, and also thanks to the myriad of people. I'm not even going to try to list all of their names because so many people messaged regarding this Xbox One S GPU upgrade. And I was like, wow, just a couple of days ago I said that the performance is the same, so I look a bit of a prat, don't I? Well, that's the nature of it. You look good one day and then you look prat the next on the internet. Well, that's the fun of it, or, you know, something. Or the humiliating part of it, I'm not sure which really. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. As usual, if you want more of my ramblings, or Amy's ramblings, then you can feel free to do the subscribe thing, or catch us on Facebook, or Twitter, or my personal Twitter, which is in the video description. But for now, I'm going to get going. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.